The first time she was handed a rifle, they laughed not with cruelty, but with certainty, like they already knew the ending, and it did not include her on the line, in the dirt, or in the fight. She took the weapon without speaking, eyes fixed not on them but on the horizon, because even then she understood that proving yourself does not start with noise. It starts with watching and waiting and knowing exactly when to move. They assigned her to overwatch not because she was unskilled, but because she was unproven, and in war those things are often treated the same. She took her place on the ridge overlooking the valley where the siege had stalled everything for 6 long days. The enemy was dug in deep, scattered and desperate, but still dangerous. And command was stretched thin, stretched quiet, stretched tired. They told her hold position, do not fire unless fired upon, and even then confirm before squeezing the trigger. She nodded once, said nothing, unpacked her gear, and lay still as the sun climbed and the heat baked the rocks around her. Her breath slow, her hands steady, the world shrinking down to the tight field of view inside her. Scope below her, the battle moved in waves, not full engagement, but skirmishes and movement, and then stillness, like both sides were circling something that neither wanted to wake the enemy. Had spotters, she could see them tucked behind rubble, signaling with broken mirrors and fingers and timing, and for hours she tracked them, catalogued them, studied the rhythm of their rotations until it was not just watching, it was knowing, until she could feel the shift before it happened, the kind of awareness that cannot be taught, only earned in silence. 1700 hours, a flash near the outer wall caught her eye, not a reflection, not a signal, but something else, something sharper. She focused and saw them, 5 figures crawling low beneath torn netting toward the fuel trucks parked just beyond the barricades, their movements slow and practiced, their gear mismatched and dirty, but their posture deadly. She reached for the radio, clicked it once, nothing again, still nothing. Command was not listening, or they were busy, or they were gone. She keyed it twice more, no reply. Looked back through the scope, now closer, now clearer, saw the lead man pull something from his pack, a shape too square, too heavy to be anything but explosive, and she made a decision, not with anger, not with fear, but with the weight of all the moments that had led to this one. She centered her aim, took a breath, and let it go. The sound was a whisper compared to what followed as the round hit and the man crumpled and chaos bloomed. The others scattered, ran, one returned fire blindly, and she dropped him too. Clean, fast, efficient. Ridge held steady beneath her, but everything else changed. The camp below woke up, sirens, bodies running, dust kicked into the air. Command barking late orders through static and disbelief, and through it all she stayed quiet, watching, tracking, breathing. One shot had ended their plan, one bullet had broken the rhythm of the siege, and no one had told her to taketh. Wind shifted just slightly, carrying the smell of burned oil and cordite across the ridge, and she knew the fight had changed, not just below, but in the minds of everyone listening, because sometimes it only takes one moment to make people question what they thought they understood about control, about command, about who is allowed to act. She stayed on the scope, not because she was waiting for praise, but because the job was not finished, and she had been in enough firefights to know that chaos attracts more chaos, and if one team had slipped through, there would be others watching, testing, waiting for the noise to clear. Her radio came to life again, not with orders, but with confusion, voices overlapping, trying to rewrite what had happened, trying to understand who had fired the shot and whether the decision had come from someone higher, someone official, someone that made it okay. And in that mess of questions, her name never came up, not because they did not know, but because they were not ready to admit it. The general's voice finally cut through the static, hard and sharp, asking who authorized engagement from the northern ridge, who gave that order, who fired that round. Said nothing, just kept her cheek against the stock, her eye on the scope, her breath steady, like nothing had changed, and in a way nothing had, except now they knew that someone on the ridge had made a decision, and that decision had saved them, and that kind of truth is hard to control, hard to suppress, and even harder to punish. She could hear the tension in their voices, the hesitation between words, as they realized punishing the person who saved the camp might be worse than letting the silence hang down below. The fuel trucks were being moved further inside the perimeter, and the engineers were running fresh lines to reroute supply through safer paths. Soldiers were double-timing between checkpoints, scanning every angle like they suddenly remembered the enemy was still watching, and maybe always had been. The siege had not broken completely, but its grip had loosened, the rhythm had cracked, the pattern disrupted, and it was because of her, because of one round and no hesitation. When the spotter finally arrived, he did not approach like a soldier, he approached like someone walking into a legend, cautious, respectful, eyes wide. He stopped 10 feet away and said, "The general wants to see you. He wants to know why you disobeyed the protocol." And she replied without moving, "I did not disobey. I saw what no one else saw, and I stopped what no one else could. That is what I was trained to do, and if they want me punished for that, they can do it face to face." He did not argue, only nodded and waited, and when she stood, rifle slung over her shoulder, dust clinging to every fold of her uniform, it was like watching the storm rise back into the sky. Quiet and slow and unstoppable, she walked past him down the narrow trail that led from stone to command post, and every step she took echoed like a question no one was ready to answer. The trail twisted down from the ridge like a scar carved into the earth, narrow and sharp with loose gravel and heat rising off the stone, and each step she took felt heavier, not from the weight of the rifle or the pack, but from the silence that followed her like a shadow that had learned how to breathe. The camp was in motion, soldiers running drills, ammo being counted, medics treating the shaken, not the wounded, because there were no new casualties, not this time, and no one could quite say why, but they all looked toward the ridge as if waiting for it to speak. She passed the mess tent, the infirmary, the weapons bay, and no one stopped her, but every pair of eyes followed her like they were watching something they didn't have a name for, something that didn't follow the same rules as the rest of them. She reached the command tent, and the guards didn't raise their weapons, didn't speak, just stepped aside like they knew it would be worse to try to stop her than to let her pass, and she didn't slow her pace, didn't ask permission, just ducked into the tent where the general stood over the map table like a man gripping the edges of a world he no longer controlled. Didn't look up at first, didn't speak, just kept staring at the red lines and the tiny flags and the ink stains of places that had already burned. Then he finally said it, "You disobeyed protocol," and she replied, "I stopped an attack. I acted when there was no one else to act, and I did it with clean aim and no regrets." And he slammed his fist down, not in rage, but in frustration, because she was right, and that was the problem, because the system wasn't built for people who were right in the wrong way. He said, "We have rules for a reason," and she said, "Yes, and sometimes those rules get people killed, and today they didn't, and if that's a problem, then your war has nothing to do with winning and everything to do with power." His jaw clenched, and the aide standing in the corner flinched, but she didn't stop because she had already crossed the line the moment she squeezed the trigger, without waiting for a voice in her ear to tell her what her eyes already knew. He leaned over the table, his voice lower, now tighter. "What do you think happens next?" he asked. "You expect a medal, you expect command to celebrate what you did," and she shook her head slowly. "I expect nothing. I want nothing. I fired because it was necessary, and now I'll take whatever comes, because I've been through worse than paperwork and silence and sideways glances from men who thought they understood war from the inside of a tent." There was a pause, then a breath, then the general turned away and picked up a folder from the table and said, "Get out of my sight and wait for further instruction," and she nodded once, turned and walked out, because that was all she needed. The waiting was familiar, the silence comfortable, and whatever came next, she would meet it the same way she had met the ridge, with eyes open, breath slow, and aim steady. She stepped out of the tent into the open heat, her boots pressing into dust that had not cooled in days. The wind had picked up faint but dry, carrying whispers and ash across the camp like stories trying to travel without permission. The soldiers avoided her eyes, not out of contempt but uncertainty, because they had seen the aftermath. They had heard the radios explode with confusion, they had watched the fuel trucks roll back untouched, and they knew without being told that one shot had made all the difference and no one else had taken it. Made her way back to her bunk, methodical and quiet, stripping off the gear, laying out the rifle with the same care someone might use to place flowers on a grave. The cleaning cloth ran down The barrel slow precise ritual, not repair, not habit, but respect. She could still see the figure in her mind, the one she dropped in the dust before the explosion, before the others scattered, before everything changed, and she knew she would remember. His face forever, not out of guilt, but because knowing your enemy means understanding what you stop it. As night fell, the lights dimmed across the camp, and the mood shifted from adrenaline to exhaustion. Soldiers slumped into cots, nurses checked vitals, drones circled overhead, and the siege pressed in again like a hand on the throat, not yet choking, but promising pressure. The general had not called for her again, but word had come down through channels that Central Command had been notified. And that never meant good things, not out here, not when command desks were thousands of miles away and cared more about paperwork than blood. Sat outside her tent, cleaning her scope in the fading light, when someone approached, slow steps, careful breath. She looked up and saw the boy from logistics, the one who always ran between departments with reports and batteries and too much curiosity. He stopped to paces away like he'd been sent, or maybe just dared, and said, "They say you broke the chain of command," and she replied, "I broke the pattern, and sometimes that's the same thing." Asked if she would do it again if given the choice, and she looked at him long enough that he shifted uncomfortably before answering, "I did not wait for a choice. I reacted because I was the only one who saw, and if that moment comes again and I'm the one watching, I will act again, because this uniform doesn't mean obedience, it means responsibility." And he nodded quietly, not in agreement, but in understanding, because sometimes learning the truth is quieter than believing. Leash watched him walk away into the night, into the lights and shadows of a camp, still unsure whether to fear her or thank her, and then she turned her eyes back toward the ridge where the siege still breathed, somewhere out there in the dark, wounded but not gone, waiting and planning, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the silence cracked again, and when it did she would be ready, rifle clean, scope clear, heartbeat steady, no orders, need death. Next morning came without warning, the kind of gray dawn that does not ask permission, just arrives and takes the color from the world. The fog rolled in thick and low, curling around tents and wires, like it had a purpose, and somewhere behind it all the siege waited, silent as always, watching just out of range. She moved through the camp like a shadow, her boots soundless, her expression unreadable. The soldiers had started to nod when she passed, not in salute, but in something closer to recognition, the way people acknowledge storms or statues or things that carry weight. Checked her gear again, not because she expected to be called out, but because readiness was the one thing they could never take from her. The rifle was clean, the scope sharp, the extra mag full, and she laid it all out like puzzle pieces that only made sense when put together under pressure. The tent around her was quiet, and for a moment she allowed herself to close her eyes and breathe, not rest, not sleep, just stillness, the kind she used to find in the seconds before the shot, when everything else faded and only purpose remained. Silence broke when the messenger arrived, a private barely 20 carrying a folded slip of paper in both hands like it might explode. She stood before he spoke, already knowing what the order said. He stammered a bit, then managed to say, "Command requests your presence, Central Envoy arriving in 1 hour," said to be a formal inquiry. She nodded, took the paper anyway, and watched him walk off like a man who had just delivered something heavier than a bullet. She put on her uniform slowly, precisely, her hands steady, her expression unchanged, the same way she had prepared for her first deployment, not with fear, but with clarity, because when you know exactly who you are, what you did, and why you did it, nothing they throw at you can bend that core. She strapped the rifle across her back, not because she planned to use it, but because it was part of her as much as the scars on her wrists or the silence behind her eyes. Outside, the camp had gone still again. People were pretending not to notice the black transport coming in from the east, low and fast, with a matte finish that didn't reflect the morning light. It landed without ceremony, and from it stepped a man and a woman, both in charcoal coats with no visible rank, only clearance badges, and that made them more dangerous than anyone with stars on their collar. They did not greet anyone, just walked straight toward the center tent where the inquiry was set to happen, where she was already waiting. Inside the tent, the air was colder, the light harsher, a single chair placed in the middle of the floor. Like a target without a wall, she sat down without being told, eyes forward, back straight, and waited as the two officials entered, closed the flap behind them, and opened their folders, and one of them said, "State your name and position," and she answered, in a voice that never wavered, "My name is Sergeant Callan Woods, Overwatch Assignment Delta Ridge Observer, and I fired one round on the 5th day of siege without authorization, and I stand by it." The man in the charcoal coat did not react right away. Just flipped a page in the folder like he was looking for something that might explain her away, maybe a mistake in her record, maybe a history of insubordination, something that would make this easier to file under error instead of necessity. The woman beside him kept her eyes on Callan, never blinking, never writing, as if studying the shape of her stillness, trying to find a weakness behind the comp. He asked her about the moment she pulled the trigger, about the timeline, about what she saw, about what she thought command would have done had she waited, and she answered each question without pause, without excuse, describing every detail from the crawling figures to the improvised device to the radio that failed and the silence that followed. They tried to push out into her words, but there was no room for it. Her tone never shifted, her gaze never dropped, and after a while the questions began to sound like echoes, not inquiry, but repetition. "You acted without clearance," the man said again, and she replied again, "I acted because clearance never came and action was needed." "You may frame that as disobedience, I frame it as responsibility." And for a moment the woman's expression flickered, not disapproval, but something else, something closer to respect or curiosity, or maybe even further. Asked her if she understood the consequences, if she knew what this could cost her, and she nodded once, slow and certain, and said, "I have always known that doing the right thing in the wrong system comes with a price. I paid it before I ever fired that shot, and I will pay it again if that is the cost of staying true to my oath." Men looked at the woman, and the woman looked at her folder, and something passed between them, unspoken, like a message they had trained to deliver through silence. And then the woman closed the folder and leaned forward and asked the question neither of them had said yet. "What do you want from this? Do you want to be cleared, to be promoted, to be praised?" And Callan shook her head once, not in dismissal, but in clarity, and said, "I want the men in that camp to know that someone was watching when no one else was. I want them to know that the silence does not mean surrender." Thrum went still after that, not with tension, but with the weight of something that could not be undone. And then the man stood and said, "This concludes the interview," and walked out without waiting for reply. The woman stayed for a second longer, eyes still fixed on Callan, like trying to memorize the moment, and then she turned and vanished into the light outside. Callan remained seated for a few seconds longer, letting the quiet settle, letting her pulse return to that slow, even rhythm she had mastered on the ridge. Then she stood, adjusted her gear, and stepped outside into a camp that did not cheer or salute or speak, but simply watched her pass like a ghost who had decided to stay. The sun had risen high by the time she reached the north wall again, not the ridge this time, just the outer perimeter where new sandbags had been stacked and new faces now stood on watch, younger soldiers, fresher gear, the kind that still asked questions with their eyes and didn't know what to do with silence. Callan stopped beside one of them, a corporal barely old enough to shave, and looked out across the field, not saying anything, just watching the tree line, like it might move, like it might blink, like it might remember what had happened the last time something tried to come through. The corporal shifted nervously, then cleared his throat and asked, "Is it true that it was just one shot?" And she nodded, still watching, and he said, "I heard it hit the driver right between the eyes through 2 layers of smoke and a broken windshield." And she nodded again and said, "That's how it happened." And the boy just stared for a moment, like he was trying to understand what it meant to be that calm under that much weight. Back in the command tent, the general stood at the map table again, but this time his posture was different, less rigid, less certain. The folders from Central still sat unopened to his left, and he hadn't touched them in hours. Instead, he looked at the new reports, the fresh drone footage, the intercepted chatter from the enemy lines, which had suddenly gone quiet since the incident. They weren't retreating, but they weren't pushing either, as if the shot had done more than kill one man. As if it had killed momentum itself, General turned as the aide stepped in with the latest status update, and he asked any more from Central, and the aide shook his head. Just one line, they said reassignment pending. And the general muttered something under his breath, then said, "Keep her on base. I want eyes on her until we know what they're planning." And the aide said, "Sir, with all due respect, if she wanted to disappear, we'd never see her leave." And the general looked at him for a long second, then nodded slowly and said, "Yeah, that's what I'm afraid of." Out on the far end of camp, Callan moved through the training yard, watching the rookies run formations, their steps out of sync, their eyes still darting to the horizon like they expected monsters. She didn't speak, didn't correct, just watched, and then stepped into the empty lane beside them and ran the drill herself, clean, sharp, perfect, without speaking, and slowly, one by one, they adjusted their pace to match hers, not because she asked, not because they were told, but because when someone moves with certainty, you follow without needing to know the destination. Be sundown, she had returned to her bunk where a folded slip of paper waited on her cot with no markings, no name, just one line: reassignment classified, report to airfield at 06, and she read it once, then burned it in the small metal tray by her gear, not out of defiance, but because whatever came next she would carry it. Without needing orders, without needing permission, without needing anything but the truth in her aim. Morning came before the camp was awake, the sky still caught between black and blue, the kind of hour where only ghosts moved and only the committed rose from bed. Her boots hit the dirt with no hesitation, no sound, just motion. She had packed the night before, though she carried only what she needed: the rifle, the sidearm to spare mags, and a small worn notebook with no name on the cover, just blank pages that sometimes caught her thoughts before they vanished into routine. The walk to the airfield was quiet, no escort, no fanfare, no one watching, or so it seemed, but from the edges of tents, behind half-closed flaps, she felt the eyes. They didn't speak, didn't salute, but they watched, and that was enough, because silence was a language she understood better than most, and it told her that the camp had decided something about her, something they would not say aloud but carried with them like an extra layer of armor. She reached the tarmac where the black transport waited, engines humming low, two rotors cutting the still air with the rhythm of consequence. The pilot didn't ask her name, just nodded toward the ramp like he'd been told who she was and why. She didn't need clearance. She climbed aboard, found the seat marked only with red tape, and sat without speaking, strapping in with the kind of ease that comes from too many rides into too many unknowns. The door sealed behind her and the world outside fell away. The hum rose into a roar, and then there was only altitude. Across from her sat a man in a clean uniform, too clean to be local. His hands rested on a steel case, and his eyes never left hers, not in challenge, not in fear, but in calculation. And after several minutes he spoke, not to ask, but to confirm. "Sergeant Callan Woods, Overwatch Specialist, Delta Ridge." Confirmed, and she gave the smallest nod. "Yes, that's me." And he said, "I'm to brief you in full once we clear airspace." And she said, "Then let's get there already." Flight was long, or maybe it only felt long because the destination was unknown, the kind of flight where the sky stays the same and the questions get louder. The man never opened the case, never checked his watch, just waited until the hum dropped and the land came into view, and then he finally said, "We're going somewhere off-grid, not officially sanctioned, not officially denied. Your actions put you on a short list. People who act when command hesitates, people who see without blinking." She didn't respond, not because she was surprised, but because she had already guessed. This wasn't punishment, this was selection, and he confirmed it when he said, "This isn't a reprimand. This is an invitation. We're building something new, and we need people who don't flinch." And you fired the shot that changed everything. She looked out the window at the shadowed shape of a base rising from the edge of nowhere and said, "Then you better be sure, because I won't follow silence unless it earns my trust." And he said, "We wouldn't have asked if we didn't know what you were capable of." The base was not on any map, at least not one she had ever seen. It rose from the desert like It had been built by silence and shaped by secrecy, everything low and armored, no insignias, no flags, just angles and steel and shadows, the kind of place where names were not used and questions were currency. She stepped off the transport before it fully landed, boots hitting the ground with purpose, eyes scanning the perimeter without thought, without hesitation. The man with the steel case followed to steps behind, but she was already walking toward the entrance, already aware of where the cameras watched and where the guards pretended not to be there. Inside, the halls were cold and narrow. Lights pulsed dimly from above, casting long lines across the floor, and the deeper they went, the quieter it became, until all that remained was the soft hum of electricity and the knowledge that they were going somewhere important, not in rank, but in consequence. At last they reached a door heavier than the rest, reinforced with layers of logic and fear, and when it opened she saw not a war room, not a prison, not a lab, but something stranger, a room full of profiles, lines of text glowing on black screens, video feeds without timestamps, grainy footage of operations that had never happened, and in the center a board covered in photos. Faces, locations, equipment, with one section marked action threshold, and under it only 3 names. Hers was one of them, and the man finally spoke. This is where we decide who gets to act when others wait, when protocols choke, when silence costs lives. And every name here has made that choice. Old Reddish stepped closer, scanning the names, recognizing a few from whispered stories and redacted files, people who had disappeared upward, not vanished, but reassigned to places that didn't exist. He handed her a folder thicker than the one Central Command had carried and said, "Your next objective is inside. Read it, memorize it, burn it, and then choose if you want, and you will not be given backup or permission or glory, only the chance to stop what others ignore." She took the folder without asking questions, sat at the corner table, and opened it slowly. The first page showed coordinates and an image, grainy but clear, of a convoy labeled humanitarian but carrying weapons disguised beneath aid supplies. The second page listed names of targets, people marked untouchable by official channels. The third page simply said, "Go dark in 36 hours, confirmed by action only, no further contact expected." She closed the folder and said nothing, just stared ahead for several seconds before she reached into her bag, removed the lighter from her side pouch, and burned every page slowly, methodically, until all that remained was ash and memory. Then she stood and said, "Where's the exit?" And the man just pointed left. No guards, no ceremony, because the kind of people who walked into that room either walked out ready or not at all. She walked out of the facility alone, the steel door hissing shut behind her like it had erased her name from every system that once kept track of her footsteps, her records, her service, her doubts. The sun was low and the horizon stretched wide and empty, with nothing but open land and thin air. No command, no signals, no orders, only the quiet that always came before a choice, and she welcomed it like an old adversary who still had one more round to throw. Her gear was light, her steps even. No hesitation in the way she moved across the sand and gravel, her new assignment already burning its way into her rhythm. She had no map, but she knew the direction, no backup, but she didn't need it, and as she reached the edge of the compound, she found the transport waiting, a single black bike, unmarked, dusty engine rumbling like a whisper, and a small satchel strapped behind the seat. Inside was what she needed, just enough to get her there, no more, no less. The ride out was along the terrain, unforgiving and the road barely visible, but she didn't flinch. She leaned into every turn, eyes steady, heart measured, the memory of the ridge still with her, not as a weight, but as proof that silence could be broken if the shot was right, if the cause was real. And somewhere between the dust and the fading sun, she realized she had stopped caring about clearance or recognition, because all that mattered now was what came next. Be nightfall. She had reached the outpost, a temporary structure tucked beneath a rock shelf, lights, dim sounds, minimal, the kind of place that existed between coordinates and was gone by morning. She dismounted, walked to the entrance, and gave no name. The sentry didn't ask, just scanned her print, nodded once, and let her through. Inside, she found a map pinned to the wall marked with 3 black circles and a red line cutting through them, and beneath it a message scribbled in block letters: mission confirmed, time begins. Nosh studied it for a long moment, then turned away and began to prep. No speech, no brief, just movement. She cleaned her rifle, reloaded her mags, laced her boots tighter than before, checked every piece twice, the kind of routine that cleared the mind and steadied the breath. And when she was done, she sat on the floor, back against the cold wall, eyes closed, not resting, just calculating, because dawn would bring her into range, and she needed to be sharper than anything they expected. And as the first light crept across the stone and dust, she rose, slung her gear over her shoulder, and stepped outside. No one to salute her, no one to record the moment, just the wind and the silence and the thin echo of engines in the far distance, heading toward the wrong place at the wrong time. And she would be there waiting, one shot, one choice, again and again, until the silence learned who she was and what it cost to ignore her.